In front of you is a photograph by the well-known American photographer Nick Ut. It's called Napalm Girl. The girl in the photo is Kim Phuc, 9 years old, fleeing in terror from a Vietnamese village with the glow of a napalm strike behind her, the same napalm the Americans were dropping on Vietnam. She suffered severe burns and spent weeks in the hospital. We'll come back to her by the end. As you've probably guessed, today we're talking about America's war in Vietnam. The Vietnam War is often considered one of the most shameful chapters in United States history. A war that gave America almost nothing, a war it effectively lost, a war that gave rise to the anti-war movement and the hippie movement, which we'll get into as well. It's a war in which numerous crimes against humanity were documented and proven. In the 1940s, Vietnam was a French colony, but a serious nationalist movement was already growing there, and a communist party had already formed. The Vietnamese were still in the discussion phase of what would eventually become a fight for independence. But then, World War II intervened. Vietnam fell into the Pacific theater of the war and was occupied by Japan. The French and Japanese struck a deal. Japan occupied the territory, but the French colonial administration stayed in place, at least nominally, in some areas. In others, where Japan had the manpower, they simply replaced French officials with their own. In 1945, the war ended. Japan, alongside Nazi Germany, lost. By that point, Vietnam already had a strong communist leader. Ho Chi Minh, the current Vietnamese capital, is named after him. Ho Chi Minh organized the League for the Independence of Vietnam, known as the Viet Minh, uniting various political factions under communist leadership. In 1945, the Japanese occupation regime was overthrown and Vietnam declared its independence. At that point, the French returned to the scene, entirely unwilling to accept that their former colony was demanding, and had effectively already declared independence, with the Japanese no longer a serious rival power. France launched the First Indochina War, sending an expeditionary corps into Vietnam. This turned into a shameful chapter in French history as well. The war back home had almost no public support. Vietnam was 1,000 kilometers from Paris. Nobody there particularly cared. Why were young Frenchmen dying somewhere in the middle of nowhere, right after the war against Hitler had just ended and peace had just been established, only for France to immediately wade into another war on the other side of the world? The French fought this war for a long time, from 1946 to 1954, and fought it badly, losing constantly. Vietnam was fighting for its own land, its own home, with Chinese backing. The French, short on funds, were increasingly propped up by American support in these final years. The U.S. spent roughly $3 billion backing the French side of the Indochina War, a staggering sum for the time. In 1954 came the famous Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where the Allied forces, French and American, suffered a crushing defeat. The Vietnamese effectively drove them off the battlefield. Then, Vice President and future U.S. President Richard Nixon even raised the possibility of a nuclear strike on Vietnamese territory. Why was the U.S. even involved? Simple. Communism was spreading across the Pacific region. China was already communist, Vietnam was on the verge of becoming communist, and nearby sat Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, all critical strategic points, all vulnerable to the same spread. American policymakers believed that if communism wasn't stopped here, it would spread further with Chinese and Soviet help, and the whole region would be lost. That's why America entered the conflict not just with money and support for the French campaign, but eventually with its own troops. American forces had already fought alongside the French at Dien Bien Phu. The French-Vietnamese War ended with the Geneva Conference in 1954. The agreement split Vietnam into North and South along the 17th parallel, the North under Ho Chi Minh and socialist, the South remaining a monarchy under its last monarch, Bao Dai. A national referendum and direct elections were supposed to follow, determining a new president or prime minister for a unified path forward. That's where the Geneva Conference concluded. It seemed, at least on paper, that peace had been established. Vietnam, like Korea before it, split into two states along a demarcation line. But in South Vietnam, the story took a different turn. The Prime Minister, Ngo Dinh Diem, overthrew the monarchy and declared there would be no peace agreement with the socialist North. He claimed the national referendum had elected him as Vietnam's ruler and effectively declared war on the North. The North, for its part, was anything but friendly toward the South. Ho Chi Minh wanted a single, unified Vietnam. And so, the Vietnam War began, still without American troops. From 1956 to 1961, North Vietnam waged a brutal guerrilla war. Political movements opposed to the Diem regime united under the name Viet Cong, fighting the government within South Vietnam backed by Ho Chi Minh through advisors, weapons, and infiltration across the demarcation line. It became a genuine campaign of terrorism against the sitting South Vietnamese government. Assassinations, bombings, shootings of officials, up to 1,000 people killed. Why did this uprising take root so fiercely? It wasn't purely about national unification. Diem's regime was a classic puppet government, of the kind seen across Latin America, Africa, and elsewhere, staggeringly corrupt. Saigon, the southern capital, was effectively run entirely by the prime minister's relatives. His brother headed the secret police, other relatives ran the banks, ministries, logistics, finance. If you weren't family or a friend of the family, you had no path forward. On top of that, American aid was being systematically siphoned off. Money and weapons intended for the army ended up sold through American officer intermediaries, and the same happened with humanitarian aid. And then there was the drug trade. After the Opium Wars, opium cultivation had spread through China and the surrounding region. The area between Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, partly Thailand too, became known as the Golden Triangle, still the center of heroin trafficking in Asia today. The South Vietnamese regime profited enormously off this trade, and the Americans knew it. They knew the regime was deeply unpopular and corrupt, but he was, in the era's phrase, our son of a bitch. Not a communist, aligned with American interests, and that mattered more than anything else. This went on for 5 years. Weapons and fighters were smuggled across the demarcation line. North Vietnamese forces conducted raids. It was effectively a full-blown civil war. At one point, South Vietnam achieved modest gains along the border, which shifted the conflict's geography. In 1961, Laos became a flashpoint of its own, sliding toward civil war between socialist forces and the Kingdom of Laos. And, through Laos, along with parts of Cambodia, weapons and soldiers kept flowing from North to South Vietnam along what became known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Despite the diplomatic agreements in Geneva, despite intermittent Cold War negotiations between the US and USSR, despite Chinese guarantees, this civil war ground on, chewing through the Vietnamese population. It continued this way until 1961. And by this point, the South Vietnamese government could no longer contain the insurgency. They were simply losing to a guerrilla force deeply rooted in the local terrain, one that consistently outmaneuvered government troops in local skirmishes. South Vietnam turned to the Americans for help. The U.S. sent 2 helicopter units to provide cover for government forces fighting the guerrillas. Still military assistance, not yet a full intervention, mirroring the aid China was giving the North. In 1963, Diem finally exhausted even American patience. A coup took place, and he and his brother were killed. The entire government turned over, and a string of South Vietnamese leaders followed in quick succession. But through all the turnover, the Americans kept a firm hand on the wheel, installing new leadership and dictating terms, focused above all on stopping the spread of communism. Around 1962-63, with Khrushchev in Moscow, Kennedy in Washington, and the Cuban Missile Crisis only just resolved, Vietnam became the next arena for the Cold War standoff. Both superpowers understood this. Kennedy attempted peace talks with the Soviet Union, with Indian mediation, hoping to freeze the conflict the way the Korean War had been frozen. The talks dragged on for a year and collapsed in 1963. There simply wasn't enough common ground. The Soviet position was that Ho Chi Minh had far more legitimate popular support and would eventually absorb the South regardless. So what was there to negotiate? In 1964, an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin involving a U.S. destroyer became a pivotal moment. There would eventually be 2 such incidents, though the second is disputed. The American destroyer was patrolling coastal waters, conducting reconnaissance, and covering its own helicopter units in case of an escalation. Officially framed diplomatically, but in practice, the destroyer sat there because it could, secure in its ability to back any American action with naval artillery at a moment's notice. North Vietnamese patrol boats operated in the same contested waters. North Vietnam considered them their own. The Americans considered it international waters. A clash broke out, and it was later confirmed, the Americans admitted this, 2 decades later, that the U.S. had actually fired first, not the Vietnamese, despite the absurd notion that 3 small torpedo boats would deliberately provoke a destroyer roughly 15 times more powerful. The patrol boats took serious damage, American aircraft scrambled, and the boats retreated to avoid being sunk entirely. The American response was immediate. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, granting the president authority to deploy American forces anywhere in the world if American interests were threatened, and Vietnam, by this reading, clearly qualified. In 1965, a full-scale American intervention began. 1965 saw three major American operations. The first, Operation Rolling Thunder, Parts 1 and 2, was a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. American strategy followed an escalation doctrine: start with smaller targets, and if the North didn't back down, escalate to larger ones. A gradual ratcheting up of pressure meant to threaten industrial infrastructure until North Vietnam capitulated. In practice, this frequently amounted to indiscriminate bombing. Two major waves of these strikes caused significant damage. Though North Vietnam already had Chinese and, increasingly, Soviet military support, including air defenses, so American pilots didn't have unchallenged control of the skies even in that first year, losses to surface-to-air missiles mounted quickly. The second operation, Operation Starlight, was a ground offensive aimed at pushing guerrilla and North Vietnamese forces back from the border area near the 17th parallel. One of the war's most iconic images, Horst Fayes's photograph of American helicopters skimming low over the jungle canopy, troops moving in under their cover, comes from this period. America drew in its Pacific allies for support. Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Thailand, Japan, the Philippines, providing humanitarian supplies, transport pilots, and weapons, all funneled through South Vietnam. North Vietnam, meanwhile, had the backing of the three pillars of world communism: China, North Korea, and, most significantly, the Soviet Union. There's a persistent legend that Soviet officers effectively won the war against the Americans in the air. Based on various historians' accounts, the actual Soviet contingent sent to Vietnam wasn't especially large, mostly instructors training missile crews and pilots, technical specialists, intelligence personnel, and certainly KGB presence, but no confirmed large combat formations. There's a semi-folkloric story-turned-song about a Soviet-flown MiG shooting down an American pilot, who, in his final radio transmission, hears the Vietnamese accented name of the pilot who downed him, actually a garbled rendering of a Russian name. Whether true or not, what's certain is that the USSR supplied genuinely modern equipment to Vietnam: surface-to-air missile systems, aircraft, tanks, not obsolete leftovers. China backed Vietnam heavily as well. The Cold War, boiling over once again, had found its newest flashpoint after Korea, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, after the standoff in West Berlin. The fighting took place in brutal terrain: jungle, rice paddies, foothills, dense green zones, completely unreadable from above, where surface-to-air units and ambushes could hide, undetected. American aircraft losses over the course of the war were substantial. The population, largely hostile to the American presence, offered the occupying forces little support, while guerrillas staged constant ambushes. The South Vietnamese government provided intelligence and guides, but by most accounts from American veterans, the U.S. Texans quote, treated its South Vietnamese allies with open condescension, essentially taking over combat operations entirely, having concluded the South Vietnamese simply hadn't learned to fight the guerrillas effectively. America divided the country into three operational sectors, aiming to gradually clear guerrilla forces zone by zone and link up cleared territory, a strategy constantly undermined by the terrain and the local population's sympathy for Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Cong. At some point, the war's character turned unmistakably brutal on both sides. Cities were leveled, jungles doused in napalm, a fast-igniting, slow-burning substance loaded into both handheld flamethrowers and, more significantly, bombs, which incinerated enormous areas uncontrollably, spreading from military to civilian targets, torching entire villages along with the jungle around them. The U.S. also carried out what would later be termed ecocide, dumping enormous quantities of herbicide on jungles and rice fields to destroy crops, aiming to convince the population that supporting the socialists meant starvation. None of this was one-sided. American pilots taken prisoner and later released described horrific torture. Any village suspected of aiding the South Vietnamese government or the Americans could be wiped out and burned to the ground by guerrilla forces. Atrocities occurred on both sides. Soldiers first fought for an ideology, and then, after watching friends die, fought for revenge, and eventually simply fought to survive, which is when war takes its ugliest forms. Civilians bore the brunt of the suffering. Rice fields burned indiscriminately, no consideration given to civilians living near military targets. One iconic photograph, Horst Fawz's Flight to Safety, shows a Vietnamese family hiding from a bombing raid in a flooded irrigation canal. As American casualties mounted and word filtered back home, an anti-war movement began to take shape. Still niche at this point, but growing first among intellectuals, then among young people broadly, as Americans increasingly questioned why they were fighting in a country that posed no threat to them at all. American psychological operations were extensive. Millions of leaflets dropped on North Vietnam urging surrender, claiming the communists were deceiving the population. Exploiting local beliefs that unburied bodies became wandering, restless spirits, the U.S. recorded voices meant to sound like these spirits and broadcast them near villages slated for ground operations, planting timed tape recorders that would play eerie wailing sounds throughout a village, playing on genuine fear among a population with limited access to outside information. American forces also worked to discredit North Vietnamese officials by sending them compromising, deliberately suspicious correspondence, hoping to trigger internal purges by North Vietnam's own security services. This propaganda campaign was remarkably effective. Defection numbers ran into the tens of thousands at minimum, with some claims reaching as high as 250,000. It's been estimated that killing one Vietnamese soldier cost the U.S. roughly $15,000, while turning a defector through propaganda cost around $125. Propaganda was, by any measure, extraordinarily cost-effective. Shortwave radio, tape recordings, leaflets, all of it worked. The other side ran its own propaganda too, backed by Chinese and Soviet support. But Ho Chi Minh himself remained the war's central unifying figure. A man commanding genuine, broad, popular loyalty on both sides of the border, unlike the opium and aid trafficking elite running Saigon. Corruption didn't stop at the South Vietnamese government. It corroded the American military as well. By the war's end, it's estimated that roughly 1 in 5 American soldiers used opium. Looting, extrajudicial killings, corruption were rampant. There are documented cases of American organized crime figures serving in Vietnam, getting wounded, returning home, and then coming back to Saigon a year later, specifically to run drug, black market aid, and smuggling operations, because there was money to be made and no real authority to stop it. This corrosive influence badly damaged military discipline and cohesion. Many soldiers, uncertain what they were even fighting for, drifted into drug use and disorder, which inevitably affected combat operations. In direct confrontations, American forces held a clear advantage, but the Vietnamese had learned to fight back effectively, and the battles grew increasingly bloody, with both sides claiming victory. There were 2 especially notorious episodes when it comes to war crimes. The first, in 1967, was the massacre at Dak Sun, where North Vietnamese guerrilla forces killed roughly 250 civilians without trial, people believed to be sympathetic to the South Vietnamese government. This is a well-documented, undisputed fact, though Vietnamese accounts tend to avoid discussing it. The second, in 1968, was the massacre at My Lai. That year, South Vietnamese guerrillas, backed by North Vietnamese forces, launched the Tet Offensive, which initially advanced successfully, pushing American forces back and briefly capturing the ancient capital city of Hue after fierce fighting, later retaken by American forces, who found evidence there too that the guerrillas and communist forces committed their own atrocities. A number of bound prisoners, executed with gunshots to the head, some evidently tortured beforehand. Most or all believed to have been allies of the South Vietnamese government, simply eliminated by the retreating guerrilla forces. American forces eventually contained the first wave of the Tet Offensive, pushing Vietnamese forces back, before a second wave triggered an uprising inside Saigon itself, involving underground insurgent cells, an uprising that was only put down with significant difficulty. It was during this Tet Offensive period that American forces received intelligence pointing to a guerrilla command post in the village of My Lai. 3 companies moved in to surround the village. The day before, a well-liked Staff Sergeant George Cox had been killed by a landmine, a loss that hit the unit hard, and at a memorial service the following morning, a chaplain reportedly spoke about avenging their fallen comrade. The next day, the assault on My Lai began. Soldiers entered the village, threw grenades into homes, cellars, and ditches where civilians were hiding. Despite there being no guerrillas present by that point, a massacre followed. One platoon in particular, commanded by Lieutenant William Calley, was later shown to have killed between 30 and 50 people. Roughly 500 civilians died overall, including infants. American forces showed no restraint whatsoever. The atrocity came to light thanks to helicopter pilot Major Hugh Thompson, who witnessed the killings from the air, saw civilians fleeing into makeshift shelters as American troops approached to throw grenades in after them, and landed his helicopter directly between the American soldiers and the shelter. ordering his door gunner to open fire on his own countrymen if they approached the civilians. Thompson personally rescued roughly a dozen civilians and an infant found in a ditch beside its already dead parents. This moment, along with a second event that same period, fractured American public opinion the way a single crack spreads across an entire pane of glass. Thompson returned to the U.S. and demanded an investigation, which was initially stalled. Wartime, a vocal conservative faction argued, was no time to prosecute American soldiers. They were fighting an enemy embedded everywhere, and no investigation moved forward for some time. The second defining moment was the photograph known as Saigon execution, a South Vietnamese police officer shooting an unarmed man point-blank in the head. It was taken during the fighting to suppress the Saigon uprising, amid a broader religious dimension to the conflict. The South Vietnamese leadership was largely Christian, while most of the country was Buddhist, and religious tensions had already flared into public self-immolations that made international headlines. This particular photograph of a point-blank execution caused an uproar in the West. The unmistakable image of an unarmed man being killed on the spot became a symbol of the brutality underlying America's entire involvement. The man giving the order was Brigadier General Nguyen Ong Ngoc Loan, leading police and army units clearing the Buddhist quarter during the uprising. He personally shot the man in front of witnesses. American Associated Press photographer Eddie Adams, riding along with Marines documenting the fighting, happened to capture the exact moment. The trigger and the shutter click nearly simultaneous, and the photograph exploded across the international press as proof of the war's inhumanity, of the brutal allies America was backing. Adams later spoke publicly, many times, about how the photograph destroyed Loan's life. Because, as Adams told it, the man Loan executed was in fact a Viet Cong operative responsible for multiple killings, some by his own hand, caught and executed on the spot as a wartime example, by the standards of the time, arguably within the general's legal authority. Adams and Loan both eventually ended up in the United States. Loan settled quietly, ran a small restaurant, and once his identity became known, faced relentless public harassment and calls for his prosecution. Adams defended him repeatedly on television, insisting Loan had solid grounds for what he did, but public opinion never forgave him. Loan died at 67. Adams reportedly regretted the photograph for the rest of his life. That's the story behind one single image. My Lai wasn't an isolated case either. A U.S. reconnaissance unit known as Tiger Force, part of the 101st Airborne Division, was documented from 1967 onward scalping killed enemy fighters, along with cutting off ears and noses, grim evidence of just how the war was actually being fought on the ground. By 1968, the North Vietnamese offensive had stalled, and it became increasingly clear to American leadership that the war had reached a strategic, dead end. Domestic opposition kept growing, and the war became the crucible for the hippie movement. Young people listening to rock music, embracing pacifism, staging large peaceful demonstrations that often ended in police crackdowns and arrests. America was in the streets, no longer willing to fight this war. 1968 became a genuinely pivotal year globally. Anti-war sentiment spread through Europe. In Paris, it converged with the famous May 1968 protests, when student demonstrators built barricades in the streets, technically sparked by an unrelated dormitory dispute, but tapping into a much broader generational rebellion against the de Gaulle government. Similar unrest erupted in Britain and West Germany. Germany's 1968 unrest would eventually give rise to the Red Army faction, a story for another time. In the Soviet Union, still in the Khrushchev thaw era, Soviet propaganda seized on the hippie movement as proof of American imperialist criminality, backing Vietnam's cause with genuine conviction, given the scale of documented American atrocities. But Khrushchev would soon be replaced by Brezhnev, the thaw would close, and 1968 would end with Soviet tanks rolling into Prague. A year of student uprisings across the world, with its roots squarely in the Vietnam War. In 1968, Richard Nixon won the U.S. presidential election on anti-communist rhetoric, but by then the anti-war movement was strong enough that even he understood troops needed to come home eventually. Though not overnight, you couldn't simply announce defeat and go home. Nixon pursued a policy of Vietnamization, increasing training, funding, and weapons support for South Vietnam while pulling back American combat troops to minimize U.S. casualties. It went poorly. The already demoralized South Vietnamese army understood exactly how this would end, and American soldiers by this point had no appetite left for fighting either. One of the war's later iconic images shows an American soldier's helmet with "War is hell" scrawled across it, about as accurate a summary as any. In 1970, a pro-American coup destabilized Cambodia, prompting an immediate response from communist forces there. North Vietnamese troops moved into Cambodia, and American forces followed to prevent the country from fully turning communist, with, inevitably, Soviet backing for the Cambodian communists as well. Cambodia, alongside Laos, became another supply corridor ringing Vietnam. By 1971, the first trickle of American troop withdrawals began, but the war didn't end. Bombing continued through 1973, peaking that year with the heaviest air campaign of the entire conflict. That same year saw the final major offensive, Operation Lam Son 719, an attempt to sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail running through Laos and Cambodia. Despite massive bombing and a large South Vietnamese ground offensive, the campaign ended in outright defeat for South Vietnam. And this is arguably the point where American leadership understood the war was truly lost. No amount of continued destruction was going to change the outcome. In 1972, Nixon made a final attempt to breathe life into the dying war effort by visiting China, opening a thaw in U.S.-China relations. Taiwan lost its UN seat representing China around this time, and with the U.S. now recognizing mainland China over Taiwan, China cut off aid to Vietnam. By that point, though, the North Vietnamese army was already well equipped, and the Soviet Union kept the pipeline of modern weapons, missile operators, and instructors flowing without interruption. Full support, alongside continued North Korean backing. 1972 brought the North Vietnamese Easter Offensive against South Vietnamese positions, launched March 30 and running until October. The communists winning local engagements, but South Vietnam, with American air support, managed to hold the overall front. Still, the Americans understood continuing the war was untenable and began pushing, through intermediaries, for North Vietnam to return to negotiations. Talks between North and South Vietnam began in late 1972 and progressed well until South Vietnamese negotiators in 1973 presented such impossible conditions that the North Vietnamese delegation simply walked away from the table entirely, facing a stalemate yet again. Just when it seemed America might extract itself without total loss of face, claiming credit for pushing both sides toward peace, the U.S. resorted to massive carpet bombing of Vietnam, including Hanoi, in what became the single heaviest bombing campaign of the entire war, dropping an extraordinary tonnage of ordnance, including napalm, essentially recreating, over several months, the devastation of Dresden wherever American air power could reach. In January 1973, negotiations resumed, and the Paris Peace Accords were signed on January 27, 1973. Under the Paris Accords, the U.S. agreed to withdraw its troops entirely, and did so. North and South Vietnam were left to jointly determine the country's political future. Once American forces were gone, by December 1974, North Vietnam moved to settle the question of South Vietnam by force. A tactical offensive began once it became clear the Americans weren't going to re-engage and that South Vietnamese bases were largely emptied out. By spring 1975, North Vietnamese forces had reached the outskirts of Saigon. South Vietnam's fate was sealed. Demoralized troops surrendered by the hundreds of thousands and, as it would later be joked, socialist forces entered Saigon without firing a shot or breaking a single light bulb. One especially striking image from this period shows a helicopter being pushed off the deck of an American aircraft carrier into the sea, part of Operation Frequent Wind, April 1975, as the U.S. evacuated embassy staff, diplomatic personnel, American citizens, and allies. Helicopters landed continuously on the embassy roof and city streets, ferrying people to Navy ships. With no room left on deck, helicopters were pushed overboard to clear space for the next arrival. The Americans couldn't evacuate everyone. North Vietnamese forces were already entering the city. What followed was grimly typical of a civil war's ending. Roughly 5 South Vietnamese generals took their own lives rather than be captured. Most South Vietnamese government officials were sent to re-education camps. Another chapter, known as the Boat People, involved those who understood that a communist takeover meant prison or execution for them. They gathered what they could, boarded boats, and tried to cross international waters to reach neighboring countries. Many drowned, many never made landfall, some made it. It remains one of the war's most tragic postscripts. Largely people who had served in some capacity in South Vietnam's government, military, or police, trying to escape with wildly varying outcomes. That marked the war's true conclusion. Ho Chi Minh did not live to see the fall of Saigon, which was renamed Ho Chi Minh City and remains a major center of modern Vietnam. Total victory, complete unification under communist rule. The United States dropped 6,727,000 tons of bombs on Vietnam over the course of the war. For comparison, roughly 2,700,000 tons were dropped on Germany during the entirety of World War II. Between 1961 and 1967, the U.S. sprayed 75 years of herbicides, destroying jungle and crops to push farming populations from North to South Vietnam. Vietnamese soil remains contaminated in many regions to this day, a genuine, lasting ecological catastrophe. There was no tribunal, no Nuremberg-style reckoning, only a civil initiative organized by philosopher Bertrand Russell, the so-called Russell Tribunal, which drew participation from figures like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, calling for American actions in Vietnam to be recognized as crimes against humanity. Nothing came of it. Public outrage was real, but it dissipated without consequence. Lieutenant Calley, responsible for the My Lai massacre, was eventually sentenced to 15 years in the 1980s, reduced to 10, then to 5, amid substantial public sympathy for him, and he ultimately served just 2 years under house arrest. The war left America significantly weakened in Southeast Asia, its prestige badly damaged. For all its carriers, missiles, helicopters, and aircraft, it had failed to defeat a guerrilla insurgency. And yet Singapore's founding leader, Lee Kuan Yew, later argued the war had served an important purpose in containing the spread of communism regardless of the outcome. Around 2 million American soldiers served in Vietnam over the course of the war. Many returned home wounded. Many died of their injuries after returning. This gave rise to what became known as Vietnam Syndrome. Both the personal difficulty veterans faced reintegrating into civilian life, the subject of films like The Deer Hunter and Rambo, and a broader national reluctance to commit American troops abroad, a doctrine of restraint born from the recognition that such interventions brought little but bloodshed and public backlash. Despite the war's failures, the U.S. did retain lasting strategic footholds, bases in Okinawa, South Korea, and Taiwan that supported wartime logistics and remain active to this day. As for the human toll, roughly 58,000 American service members killed, with estimates of another 100,000, 150,000 dying afterward from war-related injuries. South Vietnam lost approximately 250,000 soldiers, with 1 million wounded. Civilian losses are unknown. North Vietnamese and Southern guerrilla forces lost roughly 1 million soldiers, with around 2 million Vietnamese civilians killed overall, a war that claimed nearly 4 million lives across more than a decade. A catastrophic toll on human life, on psychology, on the environment. Vietnam laid bare with brutal clarity nearly everything unjust and horrifying that war can produce. Finally, back to the photograph we opened with, 9-year-old Kim Phuc. Her chances of survival were slim, but she lived, despite catastrophic napalm burns, nursed back to health in the hospital. As she later described it herself, she became a tool of propaganda, used by communist Vietnam at party conferences and public forums, touring socialist countries, appearing in Cuba, in Africa, presenting herself as living proof of American wartime brutality. Kim eventually grew up and immigrated to Canada, where she still lives today, found again by the public roughly a decade ago after years out of the spotlight. A story that began in horror and, in the end, found something like peace.